Welcome to Kuma English Listening Hub. Today we're exploring something that looks simple, even a little messy, but is actually a living ecosystem you can keep on your kitchen counter: a sourdough starter. If you've ever seen a jar of bubbly paste and wondered why people treat it like a pet, you're not alone. But once you understand what's happening inside that jar, sourdough becomes less like a trend and more like a small lesson in biology, chemistry, and culture. Let's start with the basic idea. A sourdough starter is a mixture of flour and water that captures wild microorganisms from its environment and from the flour itself. Over time, those microorganisms form a stable community that can raise bread without commercial yeast. Instead of opening a packet of dried yeast, you rely on a naturally balanced partnership between yeast and bacteria. Now, when people say wild yeast, it's easy to imagine yeast floating dramatically through the air like invisible dust. In reality, some microorganisms do come from the environment, but many of the key players arrive on the flour. Grains carry microbes from fields, storage, and milling equipment. When flour meets water, you create a comfortable place for certain species to wake up, eat, and multiply. So, who exactly moves in? Two main groups. First, yeasts, which produce carbon dioxide gas that makes dough rise. Second, lactic acid bacteria, which produce acids that give sourdough its tangy flavor and help protect the starter from unwanted microbes. This relationship is not just friendly, it's practical. Yeasts are excellent at creating gas, but many yeasts are not great at tolerating very acidic conditions. Lactic acid bacteria, on the other hand, can thrive in acidity and can even make the environment more acidic as they metabolize sugars. Surprisingly, many sourdough yeasts have adapted to live alongside these bacteria. The result is a community where each group shapes the environment in a way that benefits the whole system. Let's zoom in on the food supply. Flour is mostly starch, and starch is basically a large chain of sugars. Microbes can't always use starch directly, so enzymes break starch down into smaller sugars like maltose and glucose. Some of these enzymes are already present in the flour, and some are produced by microbes. Once sugars become available, yeasts ferment them and release carbon dioxide and alcohol, while bacteria produce lactic acid and sometimes acetic acid. You might recognize lactic acid from yogurt, and that's a useful connection. In both cases, lactic acid bacteria turn sugars into acid, changing flavor and texture. In bread, that acidity does more than provide taste. It strengthens gluten in a particular way, improves shelf life by slowing mold growth, and affects how the crust browns in the oven. Here's a question many learners ask. Why does sourdough take longer than bread made with commercial yeast? The answer is speed and specialization. Commercial yeast is selected to work quickly and predictably. In a starter, you're dealing with a complex community that grows and changes depending on temperature, feeding schedule, hydration, and flour type. That ecosystem is powerful, but it's not designed for maximum speed. It's designed for survival and balance. This is where the idea of feeding a starter comes in. Feeding is simply adding fresh flour and water, which dilutes the acids and gives the microbes new food. If you never feed it, acidity can become too high, nutrients run out, and the community becomes stressed. A stressed starter may smell unpleasant, rise weakly, or separate into layers. If you've ever seen a dark liquid on top of a neglected starter, that is commonly called hooch. It's a sign that the starter is hungry. The microbes have used up most of the available sugars and produced alcohol and acids. The liquid itself is not necessarily dangerous, but it indicates imbalance. Stirring it in or pouring it off, then feeding the starter, usually brings it back. Let's talk about smell, because sourdough has a surprisingly wide aroma vocabulary. A healthy starter can smell like yogurt, apples, beer, or even mild vinegar. Those differences are connected to the types of acids being produced and the fermentation conditions. Lactic acid tends to smell softer and creamier. Acetic acid, which is the acid in vinegar, can smell sharper. If a starter smells like harsh chemicals or rotten food, that's a sign something else has taken over, and it may be safer to start again. Temperature is another major influence. Warmer conditions speed up fermentation. Colder conditions slow it down and can shift the balance of acids. Bakers often manipulate temperature for flavor. If you ferment dough cool and slow, you often get more complex flavors, sometimes with more acetic sharpness. If you ferment warmer and faster, you may get a milder sourness and a more straightforward aroma. Hydration matters too. A wetter starter with more water tends to encourage different fermentation patterns than a stiff starter. Stiffer starters often favor acid production in a way that can lead to a more pronounced tang, although the exact outcome depends on many variables. This is why sourdough can feel like both science and art. The same basic ingredients can produce many results. Now, you might be thinking, if sourdough depends on local microbes, does every city have its own unique sourdough? People love that idea, and there is some truth to it, but it's not as simple as a city having one signature microbe. Starters are influenced by flour type, household conditions, water minerals, and the baker's routine. Two starters in the same neighborhood can behave differently because one is fed rye flour and kept warm, while another is fed white flour and kept cooler. Also, once a starter is established, it becomes fairly stable. The community can resist invasion because the acidity and the competition make it hard for newcomers to take over. That's part of why sourdough is relatively safe compared with many other fermentations. The acidic environment acts like a security system. Let's connect this to bread texture. When sourdough ferments, it doesn't just inflate dough with gas. It also changes gluten, the protein network that traps that gas. Over time, acids and enzymes affect how stretchy and how strong the dough becomes. If fermentation goes too far, the dough can become weak and collapse. If it's too short, the dough may be tight and dense. Learning to recognize the right stage is one of the key skills in sourdough baking. Another interesting point is digestion. Some people say sourdough feels easier to digest than regular bread. The science is still developing, but there are plausible explanations. Long fermentation can reduce certain compounds that cause discomfort for some people, and it can change how starches behave. That said, sourdough is not magic, and it's not automatically suitable for everyone. For example, sourdough still contains gluten unless it's made from gluten-free grains. Sourdough also connects to history. Before commercial yeast became common in the 19th century, sourdough methods were a major way to make leavened bread. In many regions, maintaining a starter was ordinary household knowledge, passed through families and communities. Modern sourdough revivals often feel new, but in reality, they're a return to an older, slower technology. If you want to start a starter, here is the simplest concept. Mix flour and water, then keep feeding it. In the first few days, you may see lots of activity, then a quiet period, then stable rising later. That early burst can be misleading. It's often caused by a temporary mix of microbes that later disappear as acidity increases. Patience is essential. A reliable starter may take 1 to 2 weeks to mature depending on conditions. When a starter is ready to bake with, it should rise predictably after feeding, often doubling within a reasonable time at room temperature. It should smell pleasant and slightly acidic, not aggressively foul. Many bakers do a simple test. They watch whether the starter reaches a peak and begins to fall. Baking at or near peak activity usually gives the best rise. Let's also address a common frustration. Why does my starter rise, then suddenly stop? Often, it didn't stop permanently. It entered a new stage where different microbes are competing and the environment is becoming more acidic. Another reason is inconsistent temperature. If your kitchen is cool at night, fermentation slows dramatically. Or you might be feeding too much or too little, changing the balance of food and acidity. If you want more control, think in ratios. A feeding ratio like 1 part starter to 2 parts water to 2 parts flour will behave differently from 1 part starter to 5 parts water to 5 parts flour. More fresh flour means more food and more dilution of acids, so the starter takes longer to peak. This is useful if you want to fit sourdough into your schedule. Finally, there's a small philosophical lesson here. Sourdough teaches you to pay attention to signs rather than the clock. Yes, recipes give times, but your dough doesn't know what time it is. It knows temperature, acidity, strength, and food supply. When you learn to observe bubbles, aroma, texture, and rise, you're learning a kind of practical scientific thinking. So the next time you see a jar of starter on someone's counter, think of it as a tiny city. Yeasts and bacteria are working, competing, cooperating, and adapting. With nothing more than flour, water, and time, you can cultivate a stable ecosystem that transforms simple ingredients into bread with a deep aroma, a crisp crust, and a story that connects modern kitchens to centuries of tradition. Thanks for listening to Kuma English Listening Hub. If you'd like, listen again and focus on the cause and effect language we use today. Words like, as a result, in reality. That said, and depending on. They're essential for C1 level clarity. See you in the next episode.